The air in the hushed conference room, already thick with the scent of old paper and nervous anticipation, suddenly solidified. A collective, almost imperceptible intake of breath created an audible vacuum. The gentle rustle of programs and the soft creak of chairs ceased. Even the distant hum of the building's ancient air conditioner, which had been a comforting low thrum, seemed to catch in its throat, a mechanical gasp drowning in what felt like its own manufactured guilt. At the head of the long mahogany table, the estate lawyer, a crisp man with silver temples and a voice accustomed to gravity, paused. His gaze, usually calm and professional, flickered almost imperceptibly towards the two figures seated front and center. They were immaculate in their dark, tailored suits, their shoulders squared with an air of practiced solemnity that now seemed to be rapidly liquefying. Their faces, moments ago composed, had gone slack, jaws unhinged, as if someone had injected Novocaine directly into their very sense of self-importance. Bequest to Senior Pastor, Reverend Thomas Albright, 1 cent. The phrase hung in the air, a tiny metallic clink. It was astonishing, almost cinematic, how quickly the ruddy health drained from the senior pastor's face, leaving it a sickly mottled gray. His eyes fixed on the lawyer were wide, unblinking pools of disbelief. A nervous, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the men, the self-proclaimed shepherds of a dwindling flock. They shifted, their polished leather shoes scuffing faintly against the carpet, suddenly acutely aware of the 40 pairs of eyes boring into them from the rows of family members behind. The only door seemed miles away, and it was quite literally blocked by a phalanx of silent, protective relatives who had loved a woman these pastors had apparently forgotten the moment her hands could no longer knead dough for communion bread or scrub the burnt edges from fellowship hall casserole pans. My grandmother Eloise, a woman with hands perpetually smelling of ivory soap and a spirit as resilient as spring steel, had poured nearly 50 years of her life into Big White Church. She was there for every unglamorous, unsung task. The graveyard shift in the nursery rocking colicky infants while their parents listened to sermons, chaperoning shivering teenagers on frigid youth retreats, stirring gigantic vats of chili for missions dinners, counting offering plates long after everyone else had gone home. It was the crucial, invisible scaffolding of the church, the work no one ever clapped for, or even truly acknowledged, but which kept the entire edifice standing. The vibrant tapestry of her service unraveled abruptly at 73 when a careless driver shattered her spine, trapping her within the quiet confines of her home for a decade. The phone, once a lifeline for church administrative duties, grew silent. Not one call, not one card, not one visit. The vibrant community she had helped build simply vanished, leaving an echoing void where fellowship once stood. The silence was finally broken not by genuine concern, but by a chillingly opportunistic appearance from an assistant pastor in her hospice room. He didn't arrive with comfort or a prayer for healing, but with a well-rehearsed predatory pitch. Sister Eloise, you've laid up so much treasure in heaven. Now remember your church in your will. Plant a seed for the future. His words, carefully chosen, felt like a desecration of her final days. She cried that day, not the gentle, mournful weeping of an old woman facing her end, but a deep, gut-wrenching torrent of tears that could make even an old Marine, like my grandfather, feel an irresistible urge to physically remove the offending party by the elbow. Yet, despite Grandpa's clear message, the pastors arrived at the will reading anyway. Impeccably dressed, their shoes gleaming, they took their places in the front row with an almost arrogant assumption of privilege, their expressions a studied blend of sorrow and expectant solemnity. They had, of course, heard the rumors, whispers of Eloise's longevity, her frugality, and the considerable estate she and my grandfather had built. They believed, with a certainty bordering on entitlement, that my grandmother's generosity would, as it always had, flow in only one direction, towards their coffers. They had no earthly idea that Eloise, from her silent bed, had orchestrated a final unforgettable sermon. It would be preached without a pulpit, delivered from beyond the grave, and punctuated not by scripture, but by a number so profoundly significant it would forever echo in that room, making people whisper for years to come. This is the poignant, powerful story of a woman who spent a lifetime being unconditionally kind, a servant's heart personified, and in her final, most impactful act, chose to be unequivocally just. If you've ever poured your heart, soul, and tireless effort into a place, a person or a cause only to learn with a bitter clarity that you mattered only for what you did, not for who you were, then this narrative is for you. Today's story isn't about rigid doctrine or theological debate, it's about fundamental decency. It's about the stark, often painful consequences when people mistakenly equate a servant's heart with an endlessly open wallet, and how one grandmother with quiet strength delivered a masterclass in establishing boundaries, reclaiming dignity, and yes, executing a meticulously planned, deeply satisfying form of revenge. Before we dive deep into the heart of this tale, do me a favor. If you believe loyalty should be a reciprocal two-way street, where effort is met with respect and care, please take a moment to like this video. Subscribe for more true, emotionally charged Reddit revenge stories that resonate with the raw sense of justice. And at the end, drop a comment below. What's the most satisfying, well-deserved justice you've ever witnessed unfold? Now let's meet the extraordinary woman who taught a room full of preachers and complacent pew warmers what true love and uncompromising accountability truly looks like. Picture, if you will, Big White Church, a towering, pristine edifice of white clapboard and a soaring steeple, presiding over a meticulously manicured southern suburb. The scent of freshly laid mulch mingled with the faint, sweet perfume of piety. Choir robes hung crisply ironed in their pristine bags, ready for Sunday, and a perpetually fundraising bus emblazoned with the church's logo sat proudly in the parking lot. It projected an image of prosperity, order, and unwavering devotion. My grandmother, Eloise, with her keen, intelligent eyes that missed nothing, her soft, melodious voice, and those wonderfully capable hands that always carried the faint, comforting scent of ivory soap, was the silent, indispensable architect of much of that order. She wasn't merely a member, she was the living memory of Big White Church. She knew precisely where the spare coffee urns were stored, which of the fellowship hall's industrial ovens ran notoriously hot, and how to coax a stubborn projector bulb back to life. She could, with remarkable ease, rock a colicky baby to soothing slumber in one arm while expertly flipping a perfect stack of golden pancakes with the other, all without a single complaint or request for recognition. On countless Sundays, I remember her in the nursery, her lap a safe haven where crying toddlers found solace, allowing exhausted young mothers a precious hour of uninterrupted spiritual peace. Wednesday night saw her in the sweltering church kitchen, orchestrating an army of casseroles, enough to satisfy 50 hungry teenagers who devoured the food as if it were indeed a spiritual gift. For summer mission trips and youth retreats, she was the first to arrive, loading vans in the pre-dawn darkness, carefully tucking personalized, handwritten notes and extra snacks into each tote bag. If a guest speaker, flustered and forgetful, realized he'd left his sermon notes or projector slides back at his hotel, it was Grandma, without a moment's hesitation, who would quietly volunteer to drive back to the city through the night to retrieve them. No applause, no grand announcements, absolutely no credit was ever sought or often given. I witnessed it myself. After 2 arduous hours over a sizzling griddle flipping hundreds of pancakes for a youth breakfast, a pastor would offer a quiet round of applause, directed not at her but at a high schooler. Let's all thank our wonderful youth leader for organizing such a fantastic prayer breakfast. It was her unique, almost self-effacing talent, consistently making others feel like the heroes, while she remained the invisible backbone. And what did she ask in return for this unending stream of devotion? Nothing material. Simply a place to belong, a community that acknowledged her, a pastor who might perhaps call her by name. The ordinary, unspoken reciprocity of human connection and communal belonging, the kind that binds people together. Then, like a discordant clang in a carefully composed symphony, came the accident. Eloise, at 73, was navigating a familiar intersection when a speeding vehicle, oblivious to stop signs, broadsided her small sedan. The world became a violent kaleidoscope of shattering glass and twisted metal. In the sterile quiet of the hospital room, the doctor's voice was a flat, uninflected pronouncement. "Mrs. Eloise, your back is broken. You won't walk again." There were no theatrical screams, no desperate tears. She simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible tremor in her chin, thanked him politely, and asked for a pen to jot down the physical therapist's name. My grandmother, ever practical, treated pain not as a defining state, but like inclement weather, present, perhaps relentless, but ultimately something to be endured and navigated. The next decade, however, would prove more challenging than physical pain. It redefined loyalty, or rather, the brutal absence of it. She phoned the church office more times than she ever disclosed to us, each call a small, hopeful offering. "Just checking in," she'd say, her voice laced with kindness, making sure it couldn't be misinterpreted as a complaint. "Tell Pastor I'm praying for him. If anyone's ever in the neighborhood, my kettle's on, and I've got fresh cookies." Yet, the answer was a consistent, deafening silence. The meticulously planned church calendar never seemed to have a single available slot for a stop on her street. Birthdays came and went, marked only by the thoughtful cards of a few neighbors from other churches, or the quiet visits of old friends who still remembered. But from Big White Church? Nothing. The absence became so profoundly loud, you could almost hear it in the way Grandma rearranged the brightly colored pills in her organizer on the table, one at a time, gently, methodically, as if she were trying to soothe her own growing disappointment. I remember her keeping a set of heavy, leather-bound hymnals on her coffee table, not to sing, but perhaps because the sheer weight of them made the room feel fractionally less empty. Hospice arrived in our home like a quiet, persistent thunder, a low, resonant hum underneath every waking moment. The machines, with their soft beeps and rhythmic sighs, lent the house a Sunday morning hush, even on a bustling Tuesday. When the call finally came, an assistant pastor from Big White Church would be stopping by. A flicker of old hope, fragile but stubborn, ignited in Grandpa's eyes. He meticulously straightened family photos, set out a plate of Grandma's favorite lemon cookies, and positioned a comfortable armchair beside her bed where a rectangle of warm afternoon sunlight pooled across her cherished patchwork quilt. The assistant pastor arrived in the early evening, a phantom of polished professionalism. His hair was impeccably styled, his dark suit uncreased, and a well-worn Bible was tucked under his arm with the studied casualness of a seasoned prop. His smile, though outwardly gentle, held the practiced, unctuous sheen of a used car salesman, a superficial pleasantness that failed to reach his cool, calculating eyes. Let's call him Pastor, because honestly he earned it. He asked how she was, but his gaze already drifted, not truly waiting for an answer. Within 2 sentences, the conversation had veered sharply, transforming into an impromptu stewardship seminar. "Sister Eloise," he purred, leaning forward slightly, "you've laid up so much treasure in heaven. You know where your heart is, there your treasure will be also." He quoted the scripture like a credit card advertisement, the words stripped of their spiritual depth, repurposed for a transactional pitch. Grandpa's jaw moved once, a slow, deliberate clench from right to left, the way it did when he was silently loading a warning into his words. "This isn't the time," he rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. Pastor nodded immediately, of course, and for precisely 80 seconds, pivoted to a superficial discussion of hymn selections, his eyes darting to his watch. Then, with an almost audible click, he returned to his original mercenary agenda. "The church," he resumed, his voice laced with manufactured urgency, "is in a season of great need. Your support, Sister Eloise, could bless generations." He uttered "your church" with an infuriating possessiveness, as if she still belonged to them, yet he had never once bothered to dial her number in a decade. The thing about truly strong, kind people? When they finally break, it's not a slow crumble. It's like a cathedral window shattering, silent for a beat, just the internal implosion, and then suddenly, 1,000 vibrant colors of pain scatter across the emotional landscape. My grandmother's lips trembled first, barely perceptible. Then her slender shoulders began to shake. She covered her face with a frail, mottled palm, and the sound that escaped her wasn't a conventional sob. It was a prayer collapsing, a half-century of unwavering faith and devoted service crumbling under the weight of such callous betrayal. Grandpa, a retired steelworker, a Marine who knew the precise shape of fear and the distinct whistle of incoming fire, moved with fluid, coiled anger. He placed his hand on the pastor's elbow. There was no overt hostility, no raised voice, just an irresistible, unyielding force that conveyed absolute finality. He escorted the man, wordlessly but firmly, to the front door, opened it, and without another spoken phrase, simply said, "Good night." The house was profoundly quiet after that. The gentle click and sigh of the oxygen machine filled the void. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, oblivious. Grandma finally whispered, her voice barely audible, "Enough." She set it to the ceiling, to the universe, to herself, a solemn, unbreakable vow. Eloise, defying all medical predictions, lived for another 6 months. We joked it was out of sheer spite, but perhaps it was out of a renewed steely purpose. With Grandpa by her side, she meticulously planned her own funeral, ensuring it would not be held at Big White Church. The funeral home, after hearing her firm request, agreed to an open microphone policy. "I want people to speak," she declared, her voice still soft but infused with an unshakable resolve. "Not preachers. People. The ones who walked alongside me." Then she summoned her lawyer, my uncle, a man who understood a quiet act of defiance when he saw one, to review the will she and Grandpa had meticulously crafted years before her accident, back when she could still turn the pages of a hymnal without a wince of pain. Here's the crucial detail, the quiet truth most people, even her closest family, were unaware of. In that original document, Eloise had faithfully set aside a double tithe, 20% of her entire considerable estate, specifically for Big White Church. This wasn't a casual bequest. It was a profound act of devotion, a financial testament to her unwavering loyalty, generosity, and gratitude to the community she believed was her spiritual home. Sometime after that soul-crushing hospice pitch, she picked up a pen again. Her hand, though trembling slightly with age, was firm as she wrote. She composed a short, concise letter, addressed to her executor. It started simply, starkly. For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church called, visited, or sent a note. She didn't embellish. She did not name names. She did not accuse. She simply, devastatingly, told the truth. Then, with the cool precision of a surgeon, she made the changes to her will. The bequest to Big White Church? Revised to precisely match the love, care, and attention they had shown her in those 10 long, silent years. 1 cent. She added the same for Pompous Pastor, the senior pastor who couldn't be bothered to stop by, and for Ass Pastor, the assistant who came only to proselytize her assets and not to pray for her soul. 1 cent each. And that double tithe, that 20% of her estate, the staggering sum that had once been earmarked for Big White Church, the number that had once been so generous, the number that would now make a room collectively gasp and inhale sharply? Eloise redirected every single cent. Her new chosen beneficiary was a vibrant, community-focused charity known as Black Charity, affiliated with a predominantly Black church located just a few miles down the road. This organization was a beacon of true Christian service, diligently feeding hungry families, clothing children with dignity, delivering hot, nourishing meals to homebound seniors, and providing essential legal aid to those who couldn't afford it. It was a place where ministry was tangible, active, and hands-on. Ironically, Big White Church had once offered them superficial support, until differences, officially couched in theological disputes, but unofficially, overtly, and painfully, rooted in racial animosity, tore them apart. The ensuing years had been filled with graceless theater, accusations, public spats, and even bitter lawsuits. But Eloise and Grandpa, quietly and without fanfare, had begun tithing to Black Charity years ago. "My church is my mission field," she often said. A simple declaration that now held a profound, almost prophetic weight. We hadn't fully grasped then that her mission extended beyond Sunday school lessons and potlucks, that it included a carefully calculated understanding of how money, in its silent, powerful flow, could preach louder and more effectively than any sermon from a polished pulpit. The funeral home was packed, overflowing with the tapestry of lives Eloise had touched. The air, cool and hushed, carried the mournful perfume of lilies and the sharp, clean scent of furniture polish. Grandpa, stoic and resolute in his finest suit, meticulously pressed by his own calloused hands, stood at the podium. His gaze swept over the sea of faces, 100 different stories reflected in their eyes. Some were red-rimmed with fresh tears, raw with loss. Others, surprisingly, already held the faint curve of a smile, because, as we all know, grief wears all its clothes at once, allowing sorrow and gratitude, remembrance and burgeoning hope to coexist. He cleared his throat, his voice steady but carrying the rasp of unspoken emotion. "This will be a little different," he announced, his gaze lingering on the now pale faces of the 2 pastors in the front row. Eloise wanted an open microphone. She wanted people to speak. Not preachers. Just people. Tell your stories. The day of the funeral dawned with a surprising, almost defiant warmth, utterly unlike the somber chill typically associated with such events. It wasn't a somber affair in the traditional sense, it was a celebration, a testament woven from the quiet threads of a life lived for others. And we did celebrated her life, not mourned her passing. The air in the modest community hall, chosen over any church for its welcoming neutrality, hummed with an intimate, deeply personal resonance. My grandson, barely tall enough for the piano bench, played a halting but heartfelt rendition of It Is Well With My Soul, his small fingers finding the familiar melody, each note a balm. Beside him, my granddaughter, with a wisdom beyond her years, coaxed quiet, resonant chords from her acoustic guitar for blessed assurance, her voice a clear, pure whisper that carried through the hushed room. Stories, not eulogies, filled the sacred space. An old neighbor, his voice gravelly with age and emotion, recalled a brutal winter night decades ago when Grandma appeared at his door through swirling snow, not just with a steaming pot of her famous chicken and dumplings, but also with an electric blanket she insisted was extra. A lie no one believed, least of all the grateful recipient. Then a young woman, now a poised and compassionate nurse, stepped forward. Her voice trembled as she shared how 20 years prior, a quiet, unassuming grandma had slipped a folded note into her hand after a youth group meeting. The note, now crinkled and yellowed, simply read, "You have a gift for caring. Don't let anyone shame you out of it." It was a whisper of affirmation that had, the nurse confessed, steered her entire life's path. People chuckled softly, tears gleaming in their eyes, recognizing the authentic, unassuming spirit of the woman they remembered. People laughed through their tears. People cried with quiet understanding. We all sang, our voices blending in hymns not of performance, but of shared memory and abiding love. Conspicuously, deliberately absent were the figures from Big White Church. Not a single pastor or elder showed. Not to preach, certainly not. Not even to sit in quiet solidarity. Not to bear witness to the profound, authentic community they had so demonstrably failed to serve, the very community Grandma had so diligently cultivated outside their hallowed, yet hollow walls. When the last hug was given, when the last grateful hand was squeezed, a consensus rippled through the lingering crowd. People murmured that it was the most comforting, most real service they'd ever attended, light without being shallow, honest without being cruel. Funerals are better without preachers anyway, someone declared with a definitive, almost celebratory, tone in the lobby, and in the profound, knowing silence that followed, not a single soul argued. It was a shared, unspoken acknowledgement of the deep chasm between appearance and substance. 2 weeks later, the somber yet satisfying atmosphere of Grandma's service gave way to the sterile formality of a law office conference room. It was a space that felt smaller than a living room, yet larger than our collectively stretched patience. Extra chairs, hastily sourced, lined the walls, and still a dozen of you stood, a testament to the family's size and the weight of the occasion. My uncle, the family's resident lawyer, a man whose calm demeanor belied a sharp legal mind, sat at the head of the polished table, his expression carefully neutral. The hushed anticipation fractured with the entrance of pompous pastor and ass pastor, moving in lockstep, their charcoal suits stark against the muted tones of the room. Their eyes, accustomed to commanding attention, swept the room not for mourners, but for the optimal seating, the power positions. They had, as a courtesy, been informed that they were mentioned in the will, both personally and on behalf of Big White Church. Their faces, usually composed for piety, now wore an unsettling expression, something you might term mourning-adjacent anticipation, a thinly veiled eagerness peeking through a veneer of solemnity. From the back, a cousin muttered, just loud enough for a few to hear, that they looked like men who just caught the scent of freshly baked bread, their hunger palpable. My uncle, with an almost imperceptible glint in his eye, gestured to the 2 chairs directly beside him at the head of the table. It was a strategically brilliant move, placing them with their backs to the door, their every reaction, their every flicker of emotion, in full unavoidable view of every family member present. If they realized the subtle trap, the exposed vulnerability of their position, they didn't show it, their focus fixated on the impending financial pronouncements. The initial bequests were tender, tangible whispers of Grandma's life. Her meticulously organized recipe boxes, plump with generations of culinary wisdom, the worn, intricately pieced quilts, each stitch holding a memory, a delicate brooch that had adorned her lapel in every cherished Christmas photo. Then came the cash gifts to the grandchildren, modest, Yes, but deeply meaningful, chosen with individual understanding. To her children and siblings, more substantial sums were allotted, gestures of lifelong love and support. And then local nonprofits, organizations rooted in the community's fabric, received genuinely generous donations. The pattern built inexorably like a slow, deliberate crescendo. The further into the will we progressed, the larger the numbers grew. You could almost feel the pastor's hope inflate, molecule by molecule, a silent, avaricious balloon expanding in the sterile air. I caught Pastor pressing his lips together, a tiny, almost imperceptible victory smile he likely didn't even realize he was making. Then my uncle paused, drawing a collective breath from the room. He lifted a second, slightly smaller piece of paper, its edges a little softened with age, distinct from the legal document. Before we proceed to the church and clergy bequests, he announced, his voice devoid of inflection, Mrs. Eloise requested that I read the following statement, penned in her own hand. A nervous flutter of chairs squeaked. People leaned forward instinctively, their eyes darting between the paper and the pastor's. Pompous pastor, still utterly oblivious, steepled his fingers, a self-satisfied pose, as if preparing to graciously accept public gratitude, completely unaware that the ground was about to shift beneath his feet. My uncle began to read, his voice steady, resonating with Grandma's own clear, unwavering convictions. For the past 10 years, not one person from Big White Church called me, came to visit me, or sent me a note to tell me I was remembered. I worked very hard for you when you needed me for many years. I cooked countless casseroles, organized innumerable potlucks, volunteered for every fundraiser. But when I needed you, when age and infirmity set in, you made it abundantly clear I did not exist. I received just one visit, when I was dying, and that was solely to urge me to remember your church in my will. It was then I realized I had allowed my church to break my heart for the very last time. That was the last time. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute, a crushing, suffocating weight. The only sound was the distant, mechanical drone of the air conditioner, grinding out cold, indifferent air, a stark counterpoint to the raw emotion that had just been unleashed. Then, with a deliberate, almost liturgical gesture, my uncle folded the letter, as if concluding a sacred reading. He laid it carefully aside and looked down at the official will, his gaze unwavering. Now, he stated, his voice returning to its formal legal tone, to the bequests. He pronounced each line with measured precision, one breath per sentence, allowing the full weight of each word to land. Bequest to assistant pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to senior pastor, 1 cent. Bequest to Big White Church, 1 cent. I swear, the fluorescent lights above flickered, a celestial punctuation mark underscoring the absurd, brutal finality of the pronouncement. A wave of suppressed laughter rose in every chest, a tidal surge of mirth that got stuck behind gritted teeth and trembling lips, because not a single one of us wanted to miss the ensuing spectacle, the inevitable encore. Pompous pastor stared blankly into the middle distance, blinking slowly, methodically, like a circuit-overloaded machine attempting to reboot. Pastor's mouth opened, closed, then opened again, a fish out of water gasping for an explanation that would never come. Color drained from both their faces, receding like a rapidly ebbing tide, leaving behind a sallow, almost sickly pallor. My uncle, however, was far from finished. The greatest blow was yet to come. There is one final bequest, he announced, his voice steady, holding the pause just long enough for the oxygen in the room to feel impossibly thin, for every nerve ending to prickle with anticipation. To a charity known as, he named Black Charity. If you grew up in the Deep South, as everyone in that room had, you understood instantly how many histories, how many unspoken narratives, how many layers of societal tension and injustice arrived with a single name. The pastors' faces underwent a visceral transformation, something I can't quite adequately describe. Shock cracked into dawning dread, then morphed into a potent, agonizing hybrid of shame and anger, worn like an ill-fitting coat. They knew. Everyone in that room could read the unspoken, ugly saga instantly. Big White Church and Black Charity had a history, a public, deeply unpleasant one, the kind where theological differences was the flimsy wallpaper used to cover systemic prejudice and racial exclusion. Grandma knew this history intimately, and with her final act, she had ensured her money would do the talking, speaking a truth they had long suppressed. "The amount," my uncle said, drawing out the words, holding the dramatic pause like a seasoned preacher before the final soul-stirring hymn, "is the same amount Mrs. Eloise once set aside as a double tithe, 20% of her entire estate." He then named the number. It wasn't just large, it was staggering. A collective, audible gasp rippled through the room. People inhaled differently when the sum articulated could buy not just one, but several substantial houses. For a full, unblinking second, nobody moved. The weight of the moment was immense, almost physically palpable. Then something like an exhalation of pure relief broke the spell. Soft laughter, almost choked, mixed with quiet, unexpected sobs, hands flying to cover mouths. It wasn't mockery in its purest sense, it was release. It was the sound of a deep, abiding justice. A breath finally being allowed back into a room that had held it in collective suspense for far too long. Pompous pastor shifted forward in his chair, a desperate instinct to stand, to somehow escape, but the sheer press of family members, silent and unyielding, formed an impenetrable barrier between him and the door. As pastor simply stared at the polished surface of the table, his face a mask of utter defeat. Grandpa, however, didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded once, a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture toward the ceiling, the same way he always did after nailing a particularly challenging long shot at the firing range. Grandma's aim indeed had been true. Herein lay the profound genius of what she did. The pennies were not petty, they were potent, loaded symbols. She wasn't merely stiffing a church out of spite or simple vengeance. She was meticulously auditing a relationship, delivering a precise, unflinching account. One sent to directly match 1 decade of profound neglect. One sent to honor the senior pastor's decade-long absence from her life. One sent for the assistant pastor's mercenary sales pitch at her deathbed, disguised as spiritual counsel. And then the deluge of abundance, the redirected wealth, to a place doing the actual, tangible, gritty work she believed in, feeding the hungry, clothing the destitute, delivering warm meals to the homebound, advocating tirelessly for the marginalized. This was the unglamorous, often unseen ministry she had quietly modeled and embodied her entire life. It wasn't merely revenge. It was a profound act of reformation. She recalibrated and redirected precious resources to the hands that actually touched the hurt, the hearts that genuinely cared, the feet that walked the difficult paths of service. After the necessary papers were signed, amidst a renewed, collective exhalation, people lingered in the hallway, the formal constraints of the law office dissolving into a low hum of conversation. There was talk, hushed and reverent, of how Grandma always did what was right, even when it wasn't loud or applauded. A cousin, wiping a tear, managed a wistful smile and said, "She gave them the sermon they never preached." Someone else echoed the earlier sentiment, now imbued with deeper meaning, "Funerals are better without preachers anyway." A few of us chuckled, then immediately wiped our faces, a kaleidoscope of emotions swirling. Grief, we understood, is complicated. Profound satisfaction can sit comfortably next to sorrow, like old familiar friends. Grandpa, his eyes quiet and reflective, took home the worn, leather-bound Bible from her bedside table. Later, he told me he found a slip of faded paper tucked into the Psalms, almost hidden. "Do justly. Love mercy. Walk humbly." She had underlined "do" with a firm, decisive hand. It was her final, indelible signature, a living testament to her philosophy. Days later, a simple, unassuming envelope arrived from Black Charity. Inside was a handwritten note, brief and profoundly moving. "We remember her. We always will." They included a photograph, not a glossy promotional shot, but an authentic snapshot of their tireless work. Volunteers, diverse and earnest, packing bags of groceries, a steaming casserole in a foil pan, a stack of diapers awaiting distribution. No elaborate ad campaign, just work. Real, tangible, life-affirming work. As for Big White Church, they didn't call. Not to argue the will. Not to offer even a belated, hollow apology. Not to ask the crucial question they should have posed years, even decades earlier. Where were we? Their silence, in its own way, was as deafening as Grandma's single cent. I've replayed the scene in the hospice room 1,000 times over in my mind. The assistant pastor, leaning in too close, his voice unctuous, spouting scripture lined up like credit derivatives, an investment pitch at the precipice of death. Grandpa's quiet, firm "not now." Grandma's ragged breath-catching breaking. Betrayal, I've come to understand, isn't merely about being used. It's about being rendered unseen, erased, after you can no longer be of use. She wasn't just underappreciated. She was, to them, utterly non-existent. And yet, in her magnificent final act, she never traded love for bitterness. She simply recalibrated that boundless love, redirecting its fierce, protective energy toward people and institutions that proved genuinely faithful. She didn't torch a church in a blaze of anger. She quietly, powerfully, lit a path for others to follow. She didn't drag men publicly through the mud. She allowed a ledger, a cold, impartial document, to speak the resonant truth. 1 cent, 1 cent, 1 cent, and then a number so immense it still humbles me. A testament to her enduring spirit and unwavering values. In other words, she taught me, with a quiet strength that reverberated through generations, what true boundaries are. Love with a spine. Let's slow the room again. Rewind and replay that pivotal moment in the law office. The conference table still holds its neat stacks of official papers, a capped pen resting beside a glass of water, a bead of condensation inching its way to the coaster. My uncle's voice is steady, unwavering, a pillar of calm amidst the rising tension. The pastor's charcoal suits, once symbols of authority, now look suddenly too heavy, too restrictive for the oppressive August air. Their starch wilting under the unspoken weight of judgment. People are trying desperately not to meet their eyes, the way you instinctively avert your gaze from someone tripping on the sidewalk, even when you warn them about the crack. Bequest to assistant pastor, 1 cent. In my head, the thought is a sharp, precise cut. That's for the calculating sales pitch, the spiritual derivatives offered at a dying woman's hospice bed. Bequest to senior pastor, 1 cent. In my head, the clarity is absolute. That's for 10 long, desolate years of silence. A decade of profound absence from the life of a woman who had given so much. Bequest to big white church, 1 cent. In my head, the indictment rings true. That's for preaching community, for championing family, all while utterly forgetting the woman who tirelessly cooked it, served it, and embodied it for you year after year. Then the charity's name. And the amount. The pastor's throats work visibly, as if trying desperately to swallow an explanation, an excuse, a rationale that simply won't come, won't form. Because what do you possibly say when the woman you so casually ignored, the one you deemed no longer useful, has just, with her final magnificent act, publicly honored the very people you dismissed as other or less than? What do you say when she has, with undeniable financial force, declared, they are doing the real work? They will receive the essential resources. Grandpa, still seated, leans back slightly, his hands folded calmly across his chest. He doesn't gloat, doesn't allow even a flicker of triumph to cross his stoic face. He doesn't need to. The point, he understands, isn't their humiliation, though that is an undeniable byproduct. It's her profound vindication. The will, in its stark simplicity, is a mirror reflecting their true selves. The room, filled with her family and true community, is an undeniable witness. And the sound you hear, beneath the hum of the ventilation, isn't cruel mocking laughter. It's the collective resonant relief that the world, for one impeccable, perfectly orchestrated moment, made perfect sense. Here's what I ultimately took from my grandmother's last, most resonant sermon. Kindness, true kindness, isn't a transactional contract. It is an inherent, unwavering calling. But genuine community, the kind that sustains and nurtures, is a contract. If you dare to preach family, if you espouse the values of kinship, you had better show up when the casseroles stop, when the giving becomes one-sided, when the need for care outweighs the prospect of gain. You had better show up, even when there's nothing left to be gained but the simple act of presence. Boundaries, far from being acts of unkindness, are profoundly generous gestures that honor the sanctity of love, self-respect, and genuine connection. In her journey, she didn't descend into bitterness or spite. Instead, she ascended to a place of crystal-clear specificity. Her actions weren't born of malice, but of precision, a deliberate choice to shepherd her precious emotional energy and genuine affection towards pathways where it would be truly received and appreciated. She intelligently directed her love, ensuring it would be thoughtfully delivered and cherished, rather than allowing it to be dissipated, diluted, and ultimately lost in the amorphous, unappreciative committee of those who merely took advantage. There are moments when the pursuit of justice, often mistakenly labeled as revenge, becomes a morally righteous act, not for the sake of inflicting pain, but to recalibrate a profound imbalance. This isn't about venomous retaliation or a destructive desire for an eye. It's about enacting a form of justice that serves a higher purpose, to teach. It's about establishing consequences that illuminate the true cost of disrespect, neglect, or exploitation. In this particular narrative, the act of sending a single cent was not a petty display of spite. It was an elegantly precise mathematical equation. It represented an exact, undeniable accounting of what was owed, what was taken, and what was now being irrefutably returned, a financial truth that cut through all pretense. The harsh reality is that while heartfelt pleas and reasoned arguments may fall on deaf ears, money speaks a universal language that institutions, perhaps more than individuals, unequivocally understand. She had invested a decade of her life, pouring out words, logic, and emotional appeals, only to be met with apathy, dismissal, or outright condescension. Her voice, however articulate or impassioned, simply wasn't registering in their ledger. But when that check, no matter how symbolic its amount, arrived, it transcended mere words. It became an undeniable, concrete message, a financial declaration that finally cut through the bureaucratic din and forced them to pay attention. They heard the check loud and clear because it spoke directly to their core values and bottom line. Perhaps you too have your own version of that big white church, a demanding corporate workplace that extracts your soul, a seemingly supportive friend group that only takes, or a complicated family branch that constantly siphons your emotional resources, always loving your effort and output far more than they ever truly valued your inherent existence. It's time to internalize the profound wisdom from her story. You don't need to scorch the earth or leave a trail of bitterness. Instead, you can choose a different, more empowering path. You can reroute your river, redirect your energy, your time, your love, and your resources toward fertile ground where they will flourish and be appreciated. Let your yes be a resounding affirmation of your boundaries, and let your no be an equally firm declaration of your limits. And when the time comes to finally close the ledger on those unreciprocated investments, let the numbers, however small or symbolic, tell the unvarnished, undeniable truth. Ultimately, Grandma didn't win, in the conventional combative sense of victory over an opponent. She did something far more profound. She blessed. She imparted a final, indelible lesson, a legacy of grace, dignity, and unwavering self-respect that resonates long after any fleeting smirk fades from anyone's face. She honored the essence of who she was, living authentically and with integrity until the very last comma, the concluding punctuation mark, of her extraordinary life story. If this narrative resonated deeply with you, sending chills down your spine or simply offering a much-needed deep breath of affirmation, please take a moment to smash that like button. Your engagement helps these vital stories, where decency and integrity truly matter, reach a wider audience. Subscribe for more long-form, emotionally charged Reddit revenge arcs that explore the nuanced spectrum of justice and personal empowerment. And in the comments below, I genuinely want to hear from you. What's a specific time you witnessed someone deliver a powerful form of justice, not with aggression, but with a remarkable blend of kindness and an unyielding backbone? And in a moment of complete honesty, what would your 1-cent message be? And who precisely would be the deserving recipient of that pointed, yet perfectly calibrated financial truth? Thank you for spending your valuable time with me today, and for reflecting on the enduring legacy of a woman who, in her final act, transformed a funeral not into a mournful ending, but into an unforgettable masterclass in dignity and self-possession. I look forward to sharing our next story with you.